The wind screamed across the empty fields, pulling at broken fences and scattering frozen dust across the barren land. Snow fell hard and fast, erasing the horizon into a blur of white. In the middle of it all, Annabeth Crowley stumbled forward, clutching a small wrapped bundle tight against her chest. Her shawl, once a gift from her mother, hung in tatters, offering little protection against the storm. Each step she took cracked the frozen ground beneath her thin boots. Every breath came sharp and painful, burning her lungs with icy needles. Behind her, the Crowley house, her supposed sanctuary, was already swallowed by the storm. No light in the windows, no voice calling her back. Only the echo of Uncle Royce's final words rang in her ears. "You shamed us, Annabeth. Better you freeze than bring more disgrace." The door had slammed before she could plead. She hadn't even been allowed to gather her things. Only the bundle, only him mattered now. Annie's fingers, stiff and cracked, tightened around the small shape in her arms. The baby hadn't cried once since his birth. He never would. But he was hers, and no amount of scorn or cruelty would tear him away from her. She moved blindly into the white, the world spinning around her. Her horse had collapsed an hour ago, buried somewhere in the snow behind her. She hadn't the strength to mourn him. She barely had the strength to keep moving. The cold whispered to her, tempting her to stop, to rest. It promised peace, an end to the ache inside her chest. She stumbled, dropping to her knees, the bundle still clutched fiercely against her heart. "God," she whispered, though her lips were cracked and bleeding, "if you still see me." The storm swallowed her prayer. Darkness tugged at the edges of her vision. She sank into the snow, the cold pressing in like a grave, and her body finally gave up. She didn't see the man who emerged from the white mist, a tall, broad figure, moving with grim purpose. She didn't feel the rough hands that lifted her from the snow. Luke Rourke said nothing as he gathered her frail body against his chest. His coat flapped in the bitter wind, his face rough and scarred beneath a wide-brimmed hut. He was no stranger to death in these lands. A man learned quickly. Mercy was dangerous out here. It could get you killed just as sure as a bullet. But when he looked down at the woman in his arms, her face bruised by the cold, her body barely more than bones and cloth, he couldn't walk away. The bundle shifted slightly between them, catching his attention. Something about the way she clung to it, even unconscious, stirred an ache deep inside him. Something he thought the war had burned out forever. Without a word, he turned toward the low hills where a battered cabin waited. Half swallowed by snowdrifts, he moved carefully, his boots crunching through the fresh powder. Every step a battle against the biting wind. Behind him, the land erased all signs of their passing. No one would know they had ever been there. No one would come looking. In Annie's arms, hidden beneath the threadbare cloth, the secret she had carried so far pressed close to her heart, silent, precious, and heavy enough to break her. Luke adjusted his grip, tightening his hold against the storm. Out here, survival wasn't about who had the strongest arms or the fastest gun. Sometimes it was about something far harder, refusing to let go, even when the world told you to. And tonight, Luke Rourke decided, without speaking, without even knowing her name, that he would not let her die. The cabin creaked under the weight of the storm, its old timbers groaning as wind clawed at the walls. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, but at least it was dry. Luke Rourke knelt by the hearth, feeding kindling into a reluctant flame, glancing back over his shoulder at the figure curled on the cot. She hadn't stirred since he carried her in. Her face was a ghostly pale, lips blue, lashes heavy with ice. She lay wrapped in a thick wool blanket he'd pulled from his trunk, her bundle, whatever it was, still pressed tightly against her chest. Luke frowned, rubbing a calloused hand over his jaw. He didn't like mysteries. In his experience, they usually got men killed. But something about this woman's stubborn grip on that small bundle, something about the sheer fight it must have taken for her to make it this far in a blizzard, made it impossible to turn away. The fire finally caught, throwing a weak glow across the rough-hewn room. It wasn't much. A battered table, 2 chairs, a few shelves lined with tin plates and empty whiskey bottles. but it was better than freezing to death outside. He poured a small measure of water from a kettle into a tin cup and moved cautiously toward the cot. "Come on, girl," he muttered under his breath. "Drink." Her eyes fluttered weakly as he lifted her head, pressing the rim of the cup to her cracked lips. She coughed once, a fragile broken sound, but some of the water trickled down her throat. Good. He set the cup aside and leaned back on his heels, studying her. She was young, younger than he'd first thought, maybe 22, 23 at most. Her hair, dark and damp, clung to her temples. Her hands, raw and red from the cold, remained fiercely locked around the bundle. Luke hesitated. He knew he should pry it away, check if it was safe. Could be anything hidden in there. A weapon, stolen goods. Desperate folk did desperate things, but the look on her face stopped him. Even unconscious, she clung to that bundle like it was life itself. Whatever it held, it wasn't something dangerous to him. It was something dangerous to her. He sighed, standing slowly. He wasn't built for this. He was a man who lived with silence and hard work, not the fragile mess of saving strangers. Yet here he was. He moved to the window, squinting through the frost-streaked glass. The snow showed no signs of letting up. Days, maybe weeks before the passes cleared again. They were trapped here, together. The thought sat uneasily in his chest. Luke had long ago made peace with solitude. It was safer that way. No attachments, no regrets, nothing to lose. But now fate had delivered this broken girl into his world, and he wouldn't turn her away. A low whimper broke the heavy silence. He turned sharply. She was stirring, her face twisting in pain or fear. A soft sound escaped her lips, barely a whisper, but he caught it. "Please, don't take him." Luke froze, his breath tight in his chest. His gaze dropped to the bundle in her arms. Him, not a possession, not a stolen treasure, a child. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He crossed back to the cot and knelt down again, more carefully this time. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "You're safe now." The words felt strange on his tongue. It had been a long time since he'd promised anyone safety, and even longer since he'd kept that promise. Annie's hands relaxed slightly, though she didn't wake. The bundle shifted, and for the first time, Luke noticed how heartbreakingly small it was. Too small. Grim understanding washed over him. He sat back against the wall, raking a hand through his hair. He didn't know this woman, didn't know her story, but he knew enough about loss to recognize its weight. Outside, the storm raged, a wall of white fury beating against the tiny cabin. Inside, in the fragile warmth of the fire, two broken souls clung to life, bound together by chance, or maybe something more. Luke closed his eyes, letting the crackle of the fire and the woman's ragged breathing fill the silence. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure who was saving whom. The blizzard stretched into a second day, swallowing the world outside in endless white. No roads, no tracks, only the steady howl of the wind and the groaning of ancient trees, straining under the weight of snow. Luke moved through the cabin with the wary steps of a man used to silence. He checked the fire, adjusted the cracked shutters, and kept a wary eye on the woman who still hadn't fully woken. Annie stirred from time to time, murmuring things he couldn't quite catch, fragments of prayers, names whispered like confessions. Once or twice, she clutched the bundle tighter against her chest, as if some unseen force might try to rip it away. Luke didn't interfere. Some ghosts a person had to fight on their own. He sat by the window now, cleaning his battered rifle out of habit, though the chances of anyone reaching them through this storm were near zero. Still, it paid to be ready. Always. Beyond the glass, the ridgeline loomed like a shadow. Sharp, rocks and twisted pines half hidden by the snowfall. He had lived near these ridges for 2 years now, ever since he'd left the wreckage of his past behind. Folks in town called him the ghost on the ridge. A man who spoke little, kept to himself, and showed up only when winter supplies ran low. Luke preferred it that way. Fewer questions, fewer chances to remember the things he'd rather forget. But now, he wasn't alone. The girl, Annie, he guessed, shivered under the blankets, her lips moving in silent conversation with some unseen memory. He could see the fever building under her skin, bright and angry. She needed food, warmth, time to heal, and protection. Luke's hands stilled on the rifle. Protection. That word had cost him everything once. He rose and crossed the room to the small stores he kept in a wooden chest. Salt pork, dried beans, stale coffee grounds. Enough to last one man through. The winter, barely enough for two. He rationed out a small portion and set a pot over the fire, stirring it mechanically, mind elsewhere. What kind of life had this girl come from? What kind of cruelty sent a woman out into a storm with nothing but grief clutched in her arms? Luke knew the answers without needing to ask. This land wasn't kind to the weak, or to women who didn't follow its rigid, brutal rules. A widow with a secret was the easiest of prey. A low moan broke his thoughts. He turned quickly. Annie struggled against the blanket now, her face contorted in panic. Her voice, when it came, was ragged with fear. "No, please, don't. Take him." Luke crossed the room in 3 strides. He knelt beside her, speaking in the same low, steady tone he had used to calm dying horses and wounded comrades. "You're safe," he said. "Ain't nobody here but me." She fought him weakly, her fists small and desperate against his chest. Luke caught her wrists, not roughly, but firm enough to hold her still. Her eyes flew open, wild and unseeing, and for a terrible moment he saw nothing but terror reflected there. "It's all right," he said again, softer this time. "Ain't no one gonna take him? Not while I'm breathing." Something in his voice must have reached her. The fight drained from her limbs, and she sagged back against the cot, gasping. Tears tracked down her cheeks, leaving glistening trails. On her pale skin, she curled protectively around the bundle once more, whispering something too low to hear. Luke released her wrists and pulled the blanket higher over her shivering form. He sat there for a long moment, watching as her breathing evened out, slow and shallow. Outside, the storm raged on, relentless. Inside, a quiet promise settled between them, unspoken but iron-bound. Luke Rourke was a man who had made many mistakes in his life, trusted the wrong men, fought the wrong battles, lost more than he cared to count. But tonight, sitting by the bedside of a broken woman and her silent burden, he made a new vow, one he didn't dare say aloud. He would see her through this storm, whatever it cost him. And for the first time in years, Luke realized he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting for something worth saving. The fire had burned low by the time Annie stirred again. Luke sat slouched in the lone chair, arms crossed over his chest, eyes half closed but never fully asleep. Years of fighting and hiding had taught him that real danger didn't always come charging through the front door. Sometimes it crept in soft, quiet, and cold as death. He heard the change before he saw it, the sudden hitch in her breathing, the small, trembling gasp as she surfaced from whatever darkness held her. Luke rose without a word and moved toward her. In the flickering light, Annie looked impossibly fragile, a ghost caught between this world and the next. She blinked up at him, confused, her hand fumbling instinctively for the bundle at her chest. "It's all right," he said, voice low and steady. "You're safe here." Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. He knelt beside the cot, waiting. At last her voice broke through, a whisper as thin as the last breath of a dying storm. Where am I?" "My cabin," Luke answered simply. "Found you out in the blizzard." Confusion flickered across her face, followed swiftly by fear. She clutched the bundle tighter, as if expecting him to tear it from her arms. Luke held up his hands, palms open. "Ain't here to take nothing from you." For a long moment, they stared at each other. Two strangers thrown together by a world that cared for neither of them. Annie's eyes, wide and wary, searched his face for lies. She must have found none. Slowly, painfully, she relaxed, though she kept the bundle close to her heart. Luke leaned back, giving her space. Storm's got the ridge locked down. No one's getting in or out for a while. Annie nodded weakly, her throat working as she tried to find her voice again. "Thank you," she rasped. He shrugged. "Wouldn't sit right, leaving you out there." He meant it too. Whatever walls he'd built to keep the world at bay, they hadn't been strong enough to ignore the sight of her crumpled in the snow, a sight that haunted him even now. A sudden coughing fit racked her thin body. Luke moved to grab the cup of water, helping her sit up enough to drink. She accepted it with shaking hands, spilling more than she swallowed, but she managed a few gulps. As he eased her back onto the cot, he caught a glimpse of something. A scrap of fabric shifting, a tiny hand poking out from the folds of the blanket she cradled. Luke froze. The bundle wasn't just memories or grief. It wasn't just a keepsake. It had been a child. His heart twisted painfully in his chest. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The weight of her sorrow was written all over her face, heavier than any storm outside. "You got kin looking for you?" he asked quietly. Annie shook her head, a tear sliding down her cheek. "None that would want me back." Luke nodded once. He understood more than she could know. He rose and busied himself with the fire, giving her time to breathe, to gather whatever pieces of herself she still had left. He had no intention of prying. Whatever her story was, it was hers to tell, if she ever chose to. The blizzard continued to batter the world outside, but here, within the fragile walls of the cabin, something else stirred. Something small, tentative, and stubborn. Hope. Luke stoked the flames higher, casting a warm light across the room. He would keep the fire going. He would keep her safe. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't even a decision. It was simply what had to be done. And for now, that was enough. Annie watched him from the cot, her eyes heavy but grateful, the faintest flicker of trust beginning to spark. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, for the first time in a long while, there was the faintest heartbeat of life. The third day dawned gray and cold, a weak light filtering through the frost-laced window. The blizzard had slowed to a steady fall of snow, but the world beyond the cabin remained smothered and silent, as if time itself had frozen. Inside, Luke moved with quiet purpose, keeping the fire alive, rationing out what little food he had left. The woman, Annie, he had heard her mumble in her fevered sleep, needed strength if she was going to survive. So did he. He ladled a thin stew into a battered tin bowl and carried it over to her bedside. Annie sat propped up now, wrapped in the thickest blanket he owned, her skin still pale but no longer deathly. Her eyes followed him, wary but clearer than the day before. "You need to eat," he said simply, holding the bowl out. She hesitated, as if unsure whether she could trust even this small kindness. Then, slowly, she reached out with trembling hands and took it. Luke pulled up the lone chair and sat across from her, silent. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the faint clink of the spoon against the bowl as Annie forced herself to swallow. She ate little, a few spoonfuls at most, before setting the bowl aside, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. He didn't press her. He didn't ask questions, he just waited. Finally, after a long moment, she spoke. Her voice was raw, fragile. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she whispered, staring at her hands. "I just had nowhere else to go." Luke leaned back, resting his arms loosely on his knees. "Ain't no trouble." Annie blinked at him, disbelief plain on her face, as if she had expected cruelty, as if she had known nothing but cruelty for a long time. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket, and her gaze dropped to the bundle resting in her lap. She smoothed the fabric over it with slow, reverent hands. Luke watched quietly, waiting. "I couldn't leave him," she said, almost too softly to hear. They told me to bury him, to forget, said it was better that way." She swallowed hard, tears filling her eyes. "But he's mine." He's the only thing I ever had that was really mine." Luke felt something twist deep inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He didn't speak. He knew. There were no words that could touch the kind of sorrow she carried. Annie wiped at her cheeks with the sleeve of the blanket, trying to gather herself. "My husband. He wasn't a kind man," she said, voice shaking. "He blamed me for not giving him a son sooner. He didn't know." She stopped, her throat working painfully. "He didn't know it wasn't me." Luke's fists clenched slowly around the fabric of his pants, but he forced his voice to stay calm. "You don't have to tell it if you ain't ready," he said. Annie shook her head. "No, I need someone to know." The fire popped and shifted as she drew a deep, trembling breath. He found out I was expecting," she whispered. "But by then he already hated me, accused me of being unfaithful, told his family, told the whole town." She trailed off, the shame burning hotter than the fire could. Luke stared at the floorboards, jaw tight. He didn't need to hear the rest to understand. Small towns didn't need proof to condemn a woman. A rumor, a whisper, that was enough to brand someone forever. And when the baby came, Annie's voice cracked. "He said it wasn't his, said it was the devil's work, my own blood turned against me." Luke lifted his head, meeting her broken gaze. "You kept him," he said, voice low. "Even when they wouldn't." She nodded fiercely, tears sliding silently down her face. Luke rose from his chair, moving to stir the fire simply to give her space. But inside, a rage was building, not against her, never against her, but against a world that punished the innocent and praised the cruel. Annie watched him, her face pale but determined. "I didn't leave because I was ashamed," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I left because I wouldn't let them put him in the ground like he was nothing." Luke turned back to her, firelight, carving deep lines across his face. "You did right," he said simply. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside that tiny room. The raw pain, the quiet courage, the unbearable weight of grief carried in silence for too long. But here, at least, Annie wasn't alone anymore. Neither was Luke. And in the battered cabin on the frozen ridge, a fragile alliance was born. Not out of convenience or necessity, but out of something far rarer. Understanding. Night pressed heavy against the cabin walls, and the fire had burned low again, painting the room in long, restless shadows. Annie had fallen into an uneasy sleep, her small body curled tightly around the bundle she refused to release, even in dreams. Luke sat at the edge of the table, one hand nursing a chipped mug of coffee, the other resting heavy on his knee. He hadn't moved for hours. The storm had eased into a steady whisper outside, but inside, a different storm churned. Quieter, colder. One he knew too well. Luke let his gaze drift to Annie, studying the fragile rise and fall of her chest. He thought of the world she had fled, the cruelty that had driven her into the teeth of a blizzard, carrying nothing but sorrow in her arms. And he thought of his own past, buried deep beneath layers of silence and scars. It had been years since he last spoke of it, years since he even allowed himself to feel it. But tonight, something had cracked open inside him, something he could no longer patch with whiskey or work or worn-out prayers. He rose slowly, careful not to wake her, and pulled his coat off the hook by the door. The cold slammed into him. The moment he stepped outside, biting at his skin, numbing his hands. But he needed it, needed the sharpness of it to ground him. The sky stretched black and endless overhead, the stars scattered like broken glass across the heavens. Luke shoved his hands deep into his pockets and walked a few paces from the cabin, the snow crunching under his boots. The past was never far away out here. It rose up from the ground like mist clinging to the trees, whispering through the stones. He closed his eyes. Images flashed behind his lids. Blood-soaked fields, the screams of dying men, the crack of rifles, the acrid stench of gunpowder. The Civil War had ended years ago, but for men like Luke Rourke, The battles never truly stopped. He remembered the faces of the boys he had led, too young, too eager, too trusting. He remembered the orders he had given, the traps he hadn't seen, the graves he had dug with his own trembling hands. Commanding men was easy when you believed you were right. Living afterward was the real punishment. Luke's fingers found the thin scar that ran from his temple down to the line of his jaw, a souvenir from the final charge he had barely survived. There were other scars too, hidden beneath his shirt, twisted into the muscle of his back and chest. Wounds he had earned, wounds he had deserved. He opened his eyes and stared out into the endless night. You didn't get to walk away from that kind of past. You just learned to carry it quieter. And maybe that was why he hadn't been able to leave Annie in the snow. Maybe he recognized the same weight in her, the same haunted grief he saw in the mirror every morning. He turned back toward the cabin, the warm glow of the fire visible through the frosted window. Inside that tiny, battered house, against all reason, something was beginning to take root, not redemption. He knew better than to hope for that. But maybe a small kind of mercy. When he stepped back inside, he found Annie sitting up, blinking at him through the gloom. "You all right?" she asked, her voice rasping with sleep. Luke hesitated, then nodded once. "Just needed some air." She watched him for a moment, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. Maybe she recognized the shadows clinging to him too. Without another word, he moved to stoke the fire, adding a few more logs until the flames roared higher, chasing the cold into the corners of the room. Annie lay back down, her hand resting protectively over the bundle, but she didn't close her eyes. Instead, she spoke into the darkness. "You're carrying something too," she said softly. Luke froze, one hand still on the fire iron. He didn't answer, didn't deny it. There wasn't any point. Instead, he sat back down in his chair, the silence stretching long and thin between them. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in it. And neither, he suspected, did she. The days passed in a tense, fragile rhythm. Outside, the snow began to soften under the weak touch of early spring. But the cold still clung to the land like a dying beast. Inside the cabin, Annie grew stronger. Her cheeks, once pale as ivory, now held a faint flush. She could sit up without trembling, could sip her stew without Luke having to steady her bowl. Yet the burden she carried, the grief, the fear, remained as heavy as ever. Luke saw it in the way she flinched at sudden sounds, in the way she curled instinctively around the bundle at night, as if expecting it to be torn from her arms, and in the way her eyes, though brighter, never truly lost their wariness. He didn't push her, didn't ask for more than she was willing to give. His world was made of silences, and in that silence Annie seemed to find something she could trust. But trust, he knew, could only shield them for so long. On the morning of the 5th day, as he returned from checking the traps along the creek, Luke spotted something that made his blood run cold. Tracks, deep boot prints in the slush, leading up toward the ridge from the valley below. Someone was coming, and they weren't alone. He crouched by the trail, studying the signs. 4, maybe 5 men, moving fast, purposeful. Luke straightened slowly, his jaw tightening. He knew the kind of men who traveled in groups out here. They weren't neighbors bringing pie and blankets. They were trouble. He made it back to the cabin in half the time, kicking the snow from his boots as he slammed the door behind him. Annie jumped at the noise, her hands flying protectively to the bundle. Luke crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing the rifle from its resting place above the hearth. "What is it?" she asked, voice trembling. "Riders," he said grimly. "Coming, up the ridge." Fear drained the color from her face. She clutched the bundle tighter, rocking slightly where she sat. Luke loaded the rifle with calm, practiced movements. "You know 'em?" Annie hesitated, then nodded. "If they're from town, they're here for me." Luke cursed under his breath, a rare break in his usual stoicism. "Not gonna let 'em take you," he said. Annie's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "You don't know what they'll do." He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Don't. Need to know. Ain't happening." A beat of silence passed between them, heavy with unspoken things. Annie rose shakily to her feet, wrapping the bundle against her chest like armor. Her legs barely held her, but she faced him with a determination that struck him hard. "I won't go back," she said, voice raw. "Not to them. Not ever." Luke nodded. Once. Neither of them needed to say it. They would stand or fall together. He moved quickly, checking the door, securing the windows as best he could. The cabin was small, defensible if he was smart, but if the men outside meant real harm, walls alone wouldn't save them. "Get by the hearth," he told her. "Stay low. Keep quiet." Annie obeyed without question, sinking into the corner where the fire's glow barely reached. Her arms tightened around the bundle, rocking it gently as if to soothe them both. Luke crouched near the window, rifle ready, every muscle coiled tight. He could hear them now. The faint creak of leather, the muffled thud of hooves breaking. Through the melting snow, closer. He narrowed his eyes, catching sight of movement through the trees. Dark figures emerging from the mist like specters. At the front rode a man in a black coat, his hat pulled low over his brow, his bearing proud and cold. Luke recognized him instantly, even without ever meeting him before. The Reverend. The man who had poisoned Annie's world with whispered judgments and public condemnation. A man who wore God's name like armor but wielded it like a blade. Luke's grip tightened around the rifle. This was no rescue party. This was a trial, and Annie's sentence had already been decided. He shifted, his weight preparing for the inevitable. Inside the cabin, Annie rocked silently, her face pale but set with fierce resolve. Outside, the echoes of the past had come calling, and this time, neither she nor Luke would run. The first knock on the door wasn't a knock at all. It was a fist, heavy and brutal, rattling the wooden frame like a warning shot. Luke stood with his back against the wall, rifle in hand, muscles wound tight as wire. His heartbeat was steady, slow, but every instinct inside him screamed that this was a powder keg, and the match had already been struck. Another blow shook the door. "Annabeth Crowley," a voice bellowed, deep and oily. "Come out now and we'll show you mercy." Luke's jaw tightened. Mercy. He knew the kind of mercy men like that offered. A rope, maybe. A shallow grave. And all done in the name of righteousness. He glanced toward the hearth where Annie crouched in the shadows, cradling her bundle, her face pale but determined. Luke shifted his grip on the rifle and stepped closer to the door. "You ain't welcome here," he called out, voice calm as stone. A murmur of surprise rippled through the men outside. A new voice spoke, colder, cutting through the cold like a blade. "This isn't your concern, stranger," said the man in the black coat. "This is a matter of moral order, of God's law." Luke almost laughed. Almost. "God's got no part in what you're fixing to do," he said. Silence. Then the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. "You protect a harlot and her bastard and you'll share her fate." Luke's knuckles whitened around the rifle. He had fought too many battles for men who used words like honor and law to mask cruelty. He would not stand aside for it now. "You want her," Luke said. "You come and take her." The door shook violently under another blow. Luke motioned for Annie to stay down, then moved swiftly to the side window, pushing it open just enough to see outside. 5 men, all armed, all eager. No good way out, no easy stand. But he'd faced worse odds before. The first man charged the door, shoulder lowered, roaring like a bull. The door buckled under the impact but held. The second blow would break it. Luke inhaled once, steadying himself, and when the door gave with a splintering crack, he fired. The first man went down hard, a cry ripping from his throat. Chaos exploded. Gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the walls, sending splinters flying through the room. Luke moved fast, reloading, firing again, ducking low to avoid the return. Shots. Annie pressed herself against the wall, shielding the bundle with her body, her face bloodless but fierce. Luke dropped another man with a clean shot to the leg, sending him sprawling into the snow. 2 remained. One fired blindly through the broken doorway. Luke rolled to the side, firing back. The man shrieked, clutching his arm. The Reverend stepped into the breach then, his black coat flaring like wings, a revolver in his hand. "You can't save her," he shouted. "She's condemned by her own sin." Luke rose slowly from his cover, rifle trained on the man's chest. "You're the only sin I see here." The Reverend's hand twitched on the trigger, but he was too slow. Luke fired. The shot caught the Reverend square in the shoulder, spinning him backward into the snow. Silence fell over the ridge, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the ragged rush of Luke's breathing. He lowered the rifle, every muscle screaming, heart pounding like a war drum. From the corner of the cabin, Annie made a small, choked sound, half sob, half prayer, and Luke crossed to her in 2 strides. "You're safe," he said, crouching beside her. "It's over." But even as he spoke the words, he knew it wasn't true. Not really. The physical threat was gone, for now. But the damage, the judgment, the scars, they ran deeper than any bullet could reach. Luke touched her shoulder gently, anchoring her to the present. Outside, the snow was stained red where it had caught the fallen men. The white purity, marred forever. Inside, by the weak light of the fire, Annie looked up at him, and for the first time he saw not just fear in her eyes. He saw trust, and a fragile, desperate kind of hope. Luke squeezed her shoulder once, then stood, guarding the broken doorway with rifle still in hand. Because winter was not yet done with them, and neither was the world. The storm had broken, but inside the cabin, the silence felt heavier than any snowfall. Luke stood guard by the shattered door, rifle still gripped in his calloused hands. His body ached from the fight, but it was a distant, hollow sensation. Nothing compared to the weight pressing down on his chest. Behind him, Annie sat by, the fire cradling the bundle closer than ever. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The wounded men outside had retreated, dragging their fallen with them. The Reverend had been among the last to stumble away, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his mouth twisted in rage and defeat. But Luke knew better than to think it was truly over. Judgment had a way of following you long after the battle ended. He turned at last, setting the rifle aside, and moved slowly to the hearth. Annie didn't flinch when he sat across from her, a sign of trust hard-won and fragile. "You saved me," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. Luke shook his head. "You saved yourself." Annie looked down at the bundle in her arms. Her fingers traced the fabric as if memorizing every thread. "For a long time," she whispered, "I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I was cursed, dirty, unworthy." Luke's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay silent. Let her speak. Let her bleed out the poison they had poured into her. "My husband. He wasn't just cruel," she continued. "He hurt me in ways I didn't have words for." Luke bowed his head, grief and fury twisting inside him. "When I found out I was with child," she said, voice breaking, "I prayed it would be different, that maybe the baby would change everything." She laughed, a sharp, broken sound. "But the baby wasn't his." Luke lifted his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. Annie's shoulders sagged under the weight of the truth. He had been gone for months, off gambling, whoring. I'd been alone for so long. I never meant for it to happen. But her voice cracked again, and she buried her face against the bundle, sobs racking her thin frame. Luke crossed the small space between them and knelt beside her. He placed a hand gently on her back, not demanding, not pressing, just there, a silent vow. "You got nothing to be sorry for," he said, voice low and fierce. "You hear me? Nothing." Annie wept harder then, as if the words had broken some final dam. Inside her, years of shame, of blame, of carrying burdens that had never been hers to bear, all of it spilled out into the room, raw and real. Luke stayed with her, steady as a stone in a river's current. When at last the storm inside her ebbed, Annie looked up, her eyes red but clearer than he had ever seen them. "I named him Samuel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It means, God has heard." Luke's throat tightened painfully. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her damp forehead. "He heard you, Annie," he said. "He surely did." She stared at him, something fragile and terrified flickering across her face, something that looked dangerously close to hope. "I don't know what happens next," she said. Luke smiled, a rare, rough thing that tugged at the corners of his scarred mouth. "Neither do I," he admitted, "but we'll figure it out. Together." The word hung between them, warm and solid in the cold cabin. Together. Annie looked down at Samuel's bundle, then back at Luke, searching his face for any hint of doubt or false comfort. She found none. Only a man as broken as she was. Man who had seen the worst of the world and chosen, despite it all, to stay. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the first weak light of spring touched the snow, turning it from blood-stained white to something softer, something almost golden. Inside, for the first time, Annie allowed herself to believe, not just in survival, but in the possibility of life beyond the pain. She leaned her head against Luke's shoulder, and he shifted to support her weight, holding her carefully, as if she were something precious, which, to him, she was. In the quiet, in the broken places, something new was taking root, and neither of them, not anymore, would have to face the future alone. Spring came slow to the high country, even as the snow melted into muddy rivulets that carved new paths through the hills. The nights remained cold, and the mornings cracked with frost. But where once the land had seemed barren and cruel, now it carried a softer promise, a chance to begin again. Luke leaned against the cabin's battered door frame, arms crossed, watching Annie move carefully through the patch of clearing. Outside, the bundle was gone now, buried on the hillside beneath a small hand-carved cross Luke had helped her fashion from driftwood and twine. Samuel Crowley, carved into the wood with the tip of Luke's hunting knife. A name no one could take from him. A name whispered every morning when the sun crested the ridge. Annie knelt by the grave now, placing a tiny handful of wildflowers. She had scavenged from the thawing fields. She stayed there for a long moment, her head bowed, lips moving in a silent prayer. Luke stayed back, giving her the space she needed. Grief wasn't a thing you hurried. He knew that too well. When she finally rose, she turned toward him, and though her cheeks were wet with tears, her eyes were steady. She walked back to the cabin, boots squelching in the wet earth, and Luke straightened instinctively, ready to meet her halfway. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. In the space between them now lived something deeper than words. A hard-earned trust, a quiet partnership forged not in promises, but in actions. Annie brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead and offered a small, wry smile. "Cabin's in bad shape," she said, nodding toward the sagging roof and battered walls. Luke chuckled, a low, rare sound. "Seen worse." "We could fix it up," she said, her voice careful, testing the weight of the idea. "Maybe even grow something. Chickens, a garden." Luke studied her for a long moment, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "We," he repeated. Annie flushed, but she held his gaze. "If you want," she added, softer now. "If you're not tired of stray souls wandering through your life." Luke took a slow step forward, then another, until they stood, so close he could feel the warmth of her skin against the morning chill. "World's full of lost souls," he said, "but I reckon you ain't lost no more." She smiled then, a real smile, wide and luminous, breaking through the last of the winter inside her. Luke reached out, rough fingers brushing lightly over her. "Knuckles, I ain't much good with words," he admitted. "Ain't much good with people either." "You're good with what matters," she said simply. The truth of it sat heavy in the air, warm and solid. He squeezed her hand gently, careful of how fragile she still looked, but knowing, deep down, she was stronger than most men he'd ever known. They stood there in the clearing, the broken cabin behind them, the rough grave a silent witness, the wild, merciless world stretching out in all directions. And somehow it didn't seem so terrifying anymore. Because home wasn't a house with fine walls or a town with clean streets and cold stares. It wasn't the approval of neighbors or the judgment of men hiding behind holy words. Home was here, in the wilderness, in the stubborn heartbeat of survival, in the steady presence of someone who refused to leave. Annie tipped her head back to look at the sky, the clouds parting just enough to let a shaft of golden light pour over the ridge. Luke watched her, memorizing the sight. She was no longer just the broken girl he'd found in the snow. She was his future. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Luke Rourke allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was worthy of one. He squeezed her hand again, firmer this time. "We'll build it," he said. "Whatever it takes." Annie smiled, tears glinting in her eyes, and squeezed back. Together they turned toward the cabin, battered, stubborn, and waiting, and took their first steps into the life they would fight to build. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. And that was enough.
In a world that often rushes to judge what it does not understand, Annie and Luke remind us that true worth isn't decided by whispers or titles. It is found in the quiet, stubborn act of choosing kindness over fear, choosing love over shame, choosing to build something new from what the world tried to break. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. What does home mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more tales like this one.